It's very interesting. Based on what you're saying, it seemed like the Indian and Western intelligence really viewed warfare as like a binary, whereas China views warfare more on a spectrum. But for the audience who just might not be too aware of what happened in the 1962 war, could you just give us a quick rundown of how it started, what happened, what the end consequences were? And then we can talk about how that has changed today, because obviously India is handling the current border crisis with China very differently.
Okay, I'll try to wrap this up as quickly as possible, but there are certain key signposts that I like to make even through this narrative, because because this whole talk is about understanding China, estimating their intentions, right? So we need to look at certain key events even prior to the war and during the war, if we need to be able to make a greater sense of China as a nation. So, as I said, the conflict actually begins in 1950 when China invades Tibet, but India is divided. There are some policymakers who feel that India now needs to take an assertive stance because the buffer that we had is lost between India and China. Whereas you have the prime minister who was who it was wishful thinking of its own, because he felt that India and China can be friends and so on. But the real border problem actually starts in 1954, because that is when. So I mean, I don't have a map here to show you, but if you can imagine that there are two sectors, one is the northern sector and the other is the eastern sector. These are the two sectors where there is conflict between India and China. The northern sector is in the present day state of Jammu and Kashmir. It's no more a state, but let's, for the sake of understanding, just imagine it is a state. And the eastern sector is close to a state called Arunachal Pradesh. Right now, the conflict here is that in the state of Arunachal, in the state of Jammu and Kashmir, Ladakh region, it's a place called Aksai Chin. Right there is human habitation is almost nil. Right, but there is before 1962, that region was important for the Chinese because a highway passed through that region from Xinjiang, connecting it to Tibet. Right, so that road was important, it was an important artery for the Chinese to move their troops so that they could conduct their operations freely and effectively in Tibet. That became an important aspect for them, but that road passed through territory that was claimed by India. So the real surprise happened there, and one, India could not have gathered good intelligence from that region because of its hard terrain and almost zero human inhabitation and so on. And then the eastern sector is in the state called Arunachal Pradesh. Now that region, there is a place called Tawang, and that is another bone of contention, because it is said that the next Dalai Lama is going to be, is going to be from there, and this is something that the Chinese don't take it well, because the whole if the next Dalai Lama happens to be from the Tawang region, then their whole claim on Tibet and the whole legitimacy comes into question. But one of the immediate impetus that for the war was from the Chinese point of view, not from the Indian point of view. From the Chinese point of view, was in the year 1959 there was a rebellion in Tibet, and once the rebellion began, you had the Dalai Lama escape Tibet and come to India as seeking asylum. So on humanitarian grounds, India granted the Dalai Lama refuge in India. But interestingly, what happened in China around this time was there was a huge perception within China that the Indians were behind this rebellion, and that was absolutely false, because this is something that your audience will need to understand about the Indian policy making at that time, because otherwise it could get a bit confusing. So you had the Prime Minister of India who believed in friendship with China, and he did not support any sort of. He was a Gandhian, he was somebody who believed in nonviolence to a great extent. So he was not completely in favor in favor of the rebellion and so on. Right, so he used to make statements like such as, we support the Tibetan movement, in the sense we believe that the Tibetans have the right to decide their own future and so on, but there was no clear indication of how that is going to come about. Whereas beneath the rank of the political leadership, the intelligence chief of the day, his name was B.N. Malik. He was the IB director. He had very close interpersonal relationships that he had developed with the British MI5 as well as the CIA. And because he wanted help from these countries and these agencies, he had given a tacit support to these to the CIA to conduct such to use India as a launch pad to send in all these trained Tibetan rebels into the Tibet region, right? I mean, if you I don't know who to recommend. So if you okay, let me just think of the right book for this. Uh, there's a book called Spies in the Himalayas, right? If you can read that book, and from the same authors, there are a couple of other books. I mean, I can recommend you if towards the end of this podcast, if possible. So they lay out in detail how the Tibetan rebels were actually trained by the CIA at the farm, right? But in order for them to be airdropped into Tibet, in order for them to be launched into Tibet, they needed the Indian territory, right? And here another interesting part is that both India and Pakistan are supporting China, supporting United States in sending in the trained guerrillas into Tibet. Whereas what the Chinese did was they chose to ignore Pakistan for the time being because they saw Pakistan as a hostile country towards India, so could be utilized against India in the long run. But but Mao and Shah were completely angry with India. I mean, they believed that Indians were actually behind the Tibetan rebellion. So that was what the Chinese used as the reason to say that now is the time for China to teach India a lesson. So yeah, so that's how the war began. But from the Indian side, for those who are sympathetic towards China, they bring up another aspect. Now that is something that I need to mention. It is known as the forward policy, right? So what the forward policy meant is that for without getting into too much of details here, based on the assessment that was drawn by the Indian Intelligence Bureau, they had made a pattern analysis to see how the Chinese would respond to Indian moves on the border, and they found that wherever there was Indian presence, the Chinese didn't actually attack them or do anything hostile. So they recommended deploying Indian soldiers all across the border in penny packets of four to eight soldiers. So when this happened, one of those posts happened to be in a contested region, and that was used as a casus belli to say that the Indians are now getting aggressive and they're trying to encroach upon our territory, and that was used as a reason for the Chinese to launch its first offensive. And so when the war began on 20th of October 1962. And then the fighting happened for about 10 days. And then there were 3 weeks of gap before, again, it commenced in November, before it wandered up on 20th of November. So the entire active fighting took place somewhere for around 10 days. That's it. And it was not a war as in a full-fledged war, but it is an important event because it caused so much of humiliation to India that even to this day, Indians are pretty much humiliated to bring up the event. While at the same time, the Chinese continue to make as much as propaganda value out of this war as possible by repeatedly telling India that, look, we taught you a lesson once, we are willing to do it again.